I never expected a small inheritance to turn me into the most hated man on Lake Tranquility, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. I was standing on the weathered dock of my grandfather's modest lake house, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the water gold when a pristine white Mercedes pulled into my gravel driveway. The car door opened, and out stepped a woman with a blonde bob so perfect it looked weaponized, clutching a leather portfolio like it contained state secrets. I'm Darren Billings, by the way. Former Army sergeant turned custom furniture maker, and as of 6 weeks ago, the unexpected owner of my grandfather's lakeside cabin. The inheritance had been a lifeline after my military service left me with a bum knee and PTSD that made working in corporate America feel like walking through a minefield. Mr. Billings, the woman called out as she marched toward me in heels that somehow didn't sink into the soft ground. I'm Rachel Kensington, president of the Lake Tranquility Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your violations. She said violations, the way most people might say war crimes, and I already knew this wasn't a welcome to the neighborhood visit. Nice to meet you too, I replied, taking another sip of my coffee. What violations would those be? I just moved in last month. Rachel's lips tightened into a thin line as she opened her portfolio. For starters, that dock you're standing on is not up to HOA specifications. The weathered wood is an eyesore. Then there's your boat. She gestured to my grandfather's old fishing boat. Commercial vehicles are not permitted to be visible from the lake. I nearly choked on my coffee. Commercial vehicle? That's a 20-year-old fishing boat that hasn't moved in years. It has visible tackle storage, which implies commercial use. She sniffed, as if the very sight offended her. And then there's the matter of your unapproved exterior paint color, the non-regulation mailbox, and these wind chimes. She pointed to the hand-carved wooden chimes my grandfather had made decades ago. With all due respect, Ms. Kensington, that's Mrs. Kensington, she corrected, flashing a diamond ring that could have paid my mortgage for a year. Mrs. Kensington, I continued. My grandfather lived here for 40 years without any HOA. I wasn't aware the property was part of one. Her smile was as cold as the lake in January. The Lake Tranquility HOA was established 3 years ago. Your grandfather was resistant, but all properties are now under our jurisdiction. These violations must be addressed within 30 days, or you'll face daily fines. She handed me a notice. The estimated cost to bring everything up to code, nearly $50,000. $50,000? I said, scanning the itemized list in disbelief. For paint and a dock repair? We maintain very high standards at Lake Tranquility. The property values depend on it. She glanced at my workshop, where I'd been building a custom dining table. And I should mention that running a business from your residence is also prohibited. As Rachel strode back to her Mercedes, leaving me with the violation notice, I noticed another resident watching from their deck across the cove. They quickly looked away when I caught their eye. Something didn't feel right about any of this. My grandfather had been sharp as a tack until his passing at 92. There was no way he would have voluntarily joined an HOA that would destroy everything he loved about his home. That night, I called my old Army buddy, Logan, who'd gone into real estate law after his service. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a long moment. Darren, did you actually read through all your grandfather's papers when you inherited the place? Logan asked. I mean, I signed what the lawyer put in front of me, I admitted. Why? Because something sounds off. HOAs can't just form and automatically include existing properties without owner consent. Pull out all the paperwork and read everything. I'll come up this weekend to take a look. I hung up and went to the old roll-top desk where my grandfather kept his important documents. As I dug through the neatly organized folders, I found a thick envelope labeled Lake Properties. Inside were deeds, not just for my grandfather's cabin, but for several other parcels around the lake. According to these papers, my grandfather owned not one, but 7 properties around Lake Tranquility, including a large tract of undeveloped land that made up the entire North Shore. Most were leased to long-term tenants under surprisingly generous terms. And nowhere in any document was there a signature binding these properties to an HOA. I was still processing this revelation when a knock came at my door. It was nearly 9 p.m., not exactly social calling hours. I opened it to find a nervous-looking man in his 60s. "Are you Darren? Frank's grandson?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder as if worried about being seen. "I am," I confirmed. "I'm Ed Thompson. I've been renting the Blue Cottage on the East Shore from your grandfather for almost 20 years. He lowered his voice. "I needed to warn you about Rachel Kensington. She's been trying to force everyone into her HOA, and she's not above using questionable methods." Ed explained that 3 years ago, Rachel and her husband, Victor, had moved into the largest house on the lake and immediately began campaigning to form an HOA. They claimed it would protect property values, but their true agenda quickly became clear. They wanted to transform Lake Tranquility from a quiet retreat into an exclusive luxury development. "Your grandfather was their biggest obstacle," Ed said. "He refused to join, and since he owns so much of the lakefront, they couldn't move forward with their plans. After he got sick last year, things got ugly. Rachel started sending violation notices to all the renters, claiming we were already under HOA jurisdiction." "Why didn't anyone fight back?" I asked. "Most folks here are retirees or working people who can't afford lawyers. Rachel's husband is a big-shot developer with connections. But your grandfather always said we'd be protected." Ed's eyes grew misty. He was a good man. After Ed left, I couldn't sleep. I spent the night going through more of my grandfather's papers, finding letters from Rachel and Victor Kensington offering to buy his properties at well below market value, along with increasingly threatening notices about compliance. In the morning, I called Logan again. "I think I'm going to need more than just advice," I told him. "Already ahead of you," he replied. "I've been doing some digging. This HOA of theirs? It's not properly registered with the state. And I found something else interesting. Victor Kensington's development company has been sued 3 times for fraudulent business practices. So what do we do? First, we gather evidence. Then we call in reinforcements. Over the next week, Logan and I worked together, contacting each of my grandfather's tenants and collecting their stories. Nearly all had received similar violation notices with exorbitant correction costs. Several had been pressured to sell their leases back to the HOA at a fraction of their value. Meanwhile, I played along with Rachel's demands, requesting an official meeting with the HOA board to discuss my violations. She agreed immediately, clearly eager to press her advantage. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday at the Kensingtons' lakeside mansion. As I pulled into their circular driveway, I noted at least a dozen cars already parked there, more board members than I expected for a small lake community. Rachel greeted me at the door with the same frigid smile. "Mr. Billings, right on time. The board is assembled in the sunroom." I followed her through a house that looked like it had been transported straight from a luxury real estate magazine. In the sunroom, about 15 people were seated, many looking uncomfortable. Victor Kensington, a tall man with a deep tan and artificially white teeth, stood at a small podium. "Welcome, Mr. Billings," Victor said with practiced charm. "We understand you wish to discuss your property's compliance issues." "Actually," I replied, "I'd like to discuss the legitimacy of this HOA first." A murmur ran through the room. Rachel's smile vanished. "I've reviewed all my grandfather's documents," I continued, "and at no point did he ever agree to join your association. In fact, I have signed statements from several of his tenants, who are also here today, stating they never consented either." On cue, Ed Thompson and 4 other tenants stood up from where they'd been seated at the back of the room. Victor's expression hardened. "This is highly irregular. Those properties are clearly within our jurisdiction, according to what legal filing?" Logan interrupted, stepping in from the hallway with a briefcase. "I'm Logan Michaels, Mr. Billings' attorney. We've searched county records, and your HOA filing does not include the proper consent forms for pre-existing properties." Rachel stepped forward. This is ridiculous. Everyone around the lake agreed. No, we didn't, Ed called out. You just started sending us bills and threatening letters. Another resident spoke up. You told me I had no choice but to join. The room erupted in overlapping conversations as more residents began sharing similar stories. Victor slammed his hand down on the podium. Enough! This meeting is adjourned. We'll address these concerns through proper channels. While we're discussing proper channels, I said, raising my voice to be heard, I should mention that I now hold the deeds to 7 properties around this lake, including the entire North Shore. I paused, letting that sink in. And I've never signed anything joining your HOA. The color drained from Rachel's face. 7 properties? That's impossible. I handed Logan my folder, and he began laying out copies of the deeds on a nearby table. Very possible, and completely legal. Now, about that $50,000 fine you tried to impose on me. Rachel and Victor exchanged a look of panic. Victor cleared his throat. Perhaps we've had a misunderstanding. We're only trying to maintain the quality of our community. By fraudulently claiming authority you don't have? Logan asked. By pressuring elderly residents and threatening them with financial ruin if they don't comply? That's not maintaining community, that's extortion. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Several board members, apparently unaware of what Rachel and Victor had been doing, demanded explanations. Others slipped out quietly, clearly wanting no part of what was unfolding. As we left the mansion, Logan was already making calls to the state attorney general's office. The evidence we'd gathered, fake HOA documentation, fraudulent violation notices, and witness statements about the Kensington strong-arm tactics, painted a damning picture. Over the next few weeks, Lake Tranquility buzzed with activity, but not the kind Rachel Kensington had envisioned. State investigators interviewed residents. Reporters from the county newspaper wrote scathing articles about the HOA scam at the lake. And I discovered more about my grandfather's legacy. Frank Billings hadn't just been a property owner, he'd been the heart of the lake community. The generous leases he offered had allowed people like Ed to afford lakefront living. The undeveloped North Shore wasn't an investment opportunity. It was a deliberate conservation effort to preserve the lake's natural beauty. 3 months after Rachel Kensington had marched onto my dock with her $50,000 fine, she and Victor were arrested on multiple charges of fraud, attempted extortion, and operating a business without proper licensing. It turned out they'd been collecting HOA fees for years, pocketing the money while providing none of the promised services. As summer turned to fall, I hosted a lakeside barbecue for all my grandfather's tenants, now my tenants. With Logan's help, I'd drawn up a legitimate community association agreement that would protect the lake's character while ensuring reasonable freedom for all residents. You know, Ed said as we watched the sunset from the newly repaired dock, fixed my way, not to Rachel's specifications. Your grandfather always said the lake would be safe once you arrived. What do you mean? I asked, surprised. He didn't even know I'd inherit everything. Ed chuckled. Frank knew exactly what he was doing. He told me once, my grandson has the rare combination of being stubborn as hell and knowing right from wrong. Said you'd face tougher enemies than entitled bullies in your military days. I felt a lump form in my throat. My grandfather and I had been close, but I'd never realized how much faith he'd had in me. That evening, as my neighbors enjoyed food and conversation around the fire pit, I slipped away to the end of the dock. The water reflected the stars, peaceful now that the threat hanging over us had been removed. A light breeze stirred my grandfather's wind chimes, the same ones Rachel had wanted removed for being non-regulation. Their gentle melody carried across the water, sounding very much like laughter. I raised my beer in a silent toast to the old man who taught me that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't property, it's purpose. The Lake Tranquility Community Association still meets monthly, but in my workshop rather than a mansion. We make decisions by consensus, not decree. And while we do have standards, they're reasonable ones that honor both the natural beauty of the place and the people who call it home. As for Rachel and Victor Kensington, Their mansion was seized and sold to cover restitution to their victims. The new owners are a family with 3 kids who fill the lake with laughter all summer long. My grandfather's old fishing boat still sits at the dock, but these days it actually gets used. Turns out crafting custom furniture for city folks who want authentic lake house pieces provides a good living, especially when you can take potential clients out fishing while discussing their commission. The custom dining table I was building when Rachel first interrupted my life now sits in my cabin's main room. Around it gather friends, neighbors, and occasionally potential furniture clients. It's built from wood harvested from the North Shore, sustainable select cuts that maintain the forest's health. That North Shore, by the way, is now officially a private conservation area. My grandfather had always intended it to stay wild, and I intend to honor that wish. The deed has been modified with a permanent conservation easement that will protect it long after I'm gone. Sometimes I think about how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't checked those papers, if Logan hadn't helped, or if my grandfather hadn't been so methodical in his planning. One woman's greed nearly destroyed a community that had peacefully existed for generations. But then I hear those wind chimes on the breeze, and I remember what my grandfather understood. Lakes may seem tranquil on the surface, but true peace comes from those willing to make waves when necessary to protect what matters.